Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Neoliberalism, a very short introduction, second edition, by Manfred B. Steger and Ravi K. Roy, narrated by Christopher Grove. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to illustrations, figures, maps, and tables included in the print and ebook editions of the book. Preface. Our 21st century world is a fundamentally interdependent place. Globalization has expanded, intensified, and accelerated social relations and consciousness across world time and world space. The digital revolution has served as a catalyst for the creation of sprawling information and communication networks that, for better or worse, enmesh individuals, states, and businesses alike. Ubiquitous transnational terrorist cells have targeted symbols of secular power and prompted Western political leaders to declare a perpetual global war on terror. Global climate change and global pandemics, like the 2020 coronavirus outbreak, have become frightening realities, forcing countries to work out a transnational strategy aimed at preventing a catastrophe of planetary proportions. Inequality among nations has accelerated. Global migration flows have increased, and large-scale trade wars involving superpowers like the United States and China have strained international relations. Obviously, we live in unsettled times. Triumphalist voices who once saw the collapse of Soviet communism as the end of history and the beginning of the unchallenged rule of American-style free market capitalism have recently been caught off guard by the tremendous appeal of the populist promise to return to the safety and stability of the bygone era of autonomous nation-states. Wavering between globalist expansion and nationalist retrenchment, the world has turned into an ideological battlefield where new ideas packaged for the social media vie for the hearts and minds of a global audience. Neoliberalism is one of these contending isms. The term was first coined in post-First World War Germany by a small circle of ideologically moderate economists and legal scholars affiliated with the academic Freiburg School, to refer to their comprehensive program of reviving the classical liberal ideal of minimal state interference in the economy. Decades later, in the 1970s, a group of Latin American economists adopted Neoliberalism as a buzzword for their more aggressive pro-market agenda. Soon thereafter, left-leaning critics in the Global South were imbuing neoliberalism with pejorative rhetoric, associating the term with cutthroat capitalism imposed by wealthy corporations and rich governments in the West. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, leftist activists and academics alike began equating neoliberalism with the Washington Consensus, a set of economic institutions and policies alleged to have been designed by the United States to globalize American capitalism and its associated consumerist culture. Other critics dismissed neoliberalism as an opaque catchphrase invented by the radical left or right-wing economic nationalists for the purpose of downgrading the intellectual achievements of mainstream neoclassical economists and more ardent free-market libertarians such as Nobel Prize winners Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman. Still others saw it as a postmodern version of quaint 18th century laissez-faire talk glorifying individual self-interest, economic efficiency, and unbridled entrepreneurship. In spite of these diverging meanings, however, the term neoliberalism has stuck in the public mind. In its heyday during the 1980s and 1990s, neoliberalism bestrode the world like a colossus, personified by Anglo-American politicians like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Bill Clinton, and Tony Blair. It confronted countries in the Global South with harsh rules and conditions for their economic development. Showing itself to be a remarkably versatile and adaptable creature, neoliberalism ate its way into the heart of the communist world. It even managed to charm post-Mao Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao into adopting socialism with Chinese characteristics. In the process, Chinese communism assumed large parts of its supposed capitalist nemesis. Over the ensuing decades, Significant parts of the neoliberal agenda were adopted by such different figures as Manmohan Singh, Junichiro Koizumi, John Howard, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Xi Jinping. But not one of these political leaders ever publicly embraced this ambiguous label, although they all shared an affinity for neoliberal policies aimed at deregulating national economies, liberalizing international trade, privatizing state-owned enterprises, downsizing government, cutting taxes, and creating a single global market. The 2008-2009 global financial crisis, GFC, and the related European sovereign debt crisis, ESDC, triggered a decade of economic volatility and insecurity that boosted the fortunes of the 1%, while saddling the 99% with stagnant wages and precarious work. As a result of these troubling developments, major components of neoliberalism have been attacked by anti-globalist populists such as Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, Jair Bolsonaro, and Marine Le Pen. The astonishing political success of these nationalist leaders, especially in such unlikely places as the USA and the UK, made concerned commentators wonder whether the international post-war liberal order was teetering at the brink of collapse. At the start of the 2020s, however, it has become clear that segments of neoliberalism have actually been embraced by these very populist leaders who have staked their entire political career on denouncing it. Is neoliberalism doomed, or will it regain its former glory? What are the major types of neoliberalism, and how did they evolve over the decades? Might new versions of neoliberalism succeed in drowning out the siren song of national populism and its nostalgic longing for a return to the good old days of territorial sovereignty and national greatness? Responding to these crucial questions, this book has been designed to introduce listeners to the origins, evolution, and core ideas of neoliberalism by examining its concrete manifestations in countries and regions around the world. Our historically sensitive journey into these variants will show that although neoliberals across the globe share a common belief in the power of self-regulating free markets to create a better world, their doctrine comes in different hues and multiple applications. Reaganomics, for example, is not exactly the same as Thatcherism. Bill Clinton's brand of market globalism diverges in some respects from Tony Blair's Third Way. Barack Obama's reformist neoliberalism differs from the austerity-oriented neoliberal framework that dominated the EU after the GFC. Political elites in the Global South, often educated at the elite universities of the North, have learned to fit the tenets of the Washington Consensus to match their own local contexts and idiosyncratic political objectives. Thus it makes sense to think of our subject in the plural, neoliberalisms, rather than confining it to a single monolithic manifestation cast in the Anglo-American mold. While neoliberalism has adapted to specific environments, problems, and opportunities, it has struggled to mount an effective counterattack against the current populist explosion. Yet new technocentric and futuristic versions of neoliberalism are being assembled as we speak. The main ideas, policies, and modes of governments fueling all neoliberal projects, old and new, lie at the heart of this volume. Carrying out our publisher's objective to keep this introduction very short, we offer a general discussion based on selective examples. Our main purpose is to present an accessible and informative, but bare, outline of a rich and complex phenomenon. Listeners who have digested the materials offered here and feel prepared to delve more deeply into our subject are advised to consult the concluding reference section. We appreciate the support of our colleagues and friends at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Western Sydney University, Southern Utah University, and the W. Edwards Deming Institute. Jenny Nuji, Luciana O'Flaherty, and their able VSI team at Oxford University Press have been wonderful to work with. But most of all, we wish to thank our respective families for their enduring love and support. Pearl, Joe, Nicole, and Yana, this book is for you. Many people have contributed to making this a better book. Its remaining shortcomings are our sole responsibility. Chapter 1. What's Neo about Liberalism? Liberalism Old and New. At a joint 2018 press conference with Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, U.S. President Donald Trump, the world's most influential advocate of trade protectionism and tighter immigration restrictions, delivered a bold sales pitch that seemed to defy his national populist principles. There's never been a better time to invest in the United States. Thanks to our massive tax cuts, historic deregulation, a strong trade policy, which has really just begun, because I will tell you over the years it has been an extraordinarily weak trade policy, the opening of American energy, and a return to the rule of law, our economy is absolutely booming. Best it's ever been. The U.S. president's odd mixture of two central pillars of neoliberalism, the deregulation of the economy and massive tax cuts, with a central tenet of economic nationalism, trade protectionism, camouflaged as strong trade policy, attests to his infamous ideational inconsistency. In addition, as we shall discuss in the final chapter, Trump's obvious incoherence also demonstrates that major parts of the free market thinking that had dominated the world for 3 decades are alive and well today, and even championed by the resurgent forces of national populism. On the other hand, Trump's contradictory remarks suggest that the unflagging globalist pro-market vision that had been originally shaped and disseminated by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher is no longer at the center of the reconfigured Anglo-American conservative parties. In fact, at the high-profile 2019 National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C., speaker after speaker denounced neoliberalism. Some, like Orrin Cass, a senior fellow at the conservative Manhattan Institute, even went so far as to eviscerate the entire classical liberal tradition by flatly stating that the market does not work. To be sure, the object of Cass's criticism, the neoliberal ideal of the self-regulating market as the main engine powering the individual's rational pursuit of wealth, had been a core tenet of economists since the late 18th century. Opposed to the mercantilist doctrine associated with European monarchs who exercised almost total control over the economy in their efforts to amass large quantities of gold for largely bellicose purposes, classical liberals like Adam Smith and David Ricardo preached the virtues of the free market and laissez-faire economics. Smith has been credited with creating the Scottish Enlightenment image of Homo economicus, the view that human beings are social creatures who seek to maximize their individual material self-interests through voluntary exchange with others in a free market. According to this view, economic and political matters are largely separable, with economics claiming a superior status because it operates best without government interference under a harmonious system of natural laws. Thus, the state is to refrain from interfering with the economic activities of self-interested citizens and instead use its power to guarantee open economic exchange. At the same time, however, Smith was fully aware of the potential for market failure. Indeed, he laid out a very carefully crafted argument on the need for a very strong, though narrow place for government intervention, especially in the cases of monopolies or where private firms attempted to manipulate and distort the market. Box 1. Classical Liberalism and the Enlightenment. Classical liberalism arose in tandem with the Enlightenment movement of the late 17th and the 18th centuries, which proclaimed reason as the foundation of individual freedom. Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, 1632 to 1704, argue that in the state of nature all men were free and equal, therefore possessing inalienable rights independent of the laws of any government or authority. Naturally endowed with the right to life, liberty, and property, humans could legitimately establish only limited governments whose chief task consisted of securing and protecting these individual rights, especially private property. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage became the gospel of modern free traders. He argued that free trade amounted to a win-win situation for all trading partners involved because it allowed each country to specialize in the production of those commodities for which it had a comparative advantage. For example, if Portugal could produce wine more cheaply than England, and England could produce cloth more cheaply than Portugal, then both countries would benefit from specialization in trade. In fact, Ricardo suggested that benefits from specialization in trade would accrue even if one country had an absolute advantage in producing all of the products traded. Politically, Ricardo's theory amounted to a powerful argument against government interference with trade. Indeed, it was used by 19th century liberals like Richard Cobden as a formidable ideological weapon in the struggle to repeal the protectionist Corn Laws in England. Classical liberals saw producers and consumers as equal actors who pursued their own discrete material needs and wants as they saw fit. Dedicated to the protection of private property and the legal enforcement of contracts, classical liberals argued that the invisible hand of the market was the most efficient and effective mechanism for allocating resources and promoting greater equality within a country, as well as facilitating peaceful commercial intercourse among nations. Their ideas proved to be a potent force in fomenting the great 18th century revolutions that toppled royal dynasties, separated church and state, and shattered the dogmas of mercantilism. For most of the 19th century, the heirs of classical liberalism sought to convince people that bad economic times reflected some form of government failure, usually too much state interference resulting in distorted price signals and propensities for moral hazard. How could there have been such a thing as market failure, they reasoned, if markets, properly shielded from the meddling state, were by nature incapable of failing? But the turbulent 20th century soon cast a dark cloud on these tenets of classical liberalism. It wasn't until the 1980s that neoliberals managed to bring back some of these quaint ideas, albeit dressed in new garments. So what happened in the intervening period? The story is well known. The fury and longevity of the Great Depression convinced leading economic thinkers like John Maynard Keynes and Karl Polanyi that government was much more than a mere night watchman, the role assigned to the state by classical liberals. At the same time, however, Keynes and his new breed of egalitarian liberals disagreed with Marxists who saw the persistence of economic crises as evidence for the coming collapse of capitalism and the victory of a revolutionary proletariat that had seen through the ideological distortions of the ruling bourgeoisie. Never again would workers fall into the clever trap of accepting their own exploitation in the name of high-sounding liberal ideals like freedom, opportunity, and hard work. Seeking to prevent revolution by means of economic reform, egalitarian liberals like Prime Minister Clement Attlee and President Franklin D. Roosevelt remained staunch defenders of individual autonomy and property rights. And yet they criticized classical liberalism for its inability to recognize that modern capitalism had to be subjected to certain regulations and controls by a strong secular state. Keynes in particular advocated massive government spending in a time of economic crisis to create new jobs and lift consumer spending. Thus he challenged classical liberal beliefs that the market mechanism would naturally correct itself in the event of an economic crisis and return to an equilibrium at full employment. Keynes linked unemployment to a shortage of private capital investment and spending in the economy. For this shortfall, he blamed short-sighted and avaricious investors whose speculative investments had destabilized the market. Committed to the market principle, but opposed to the unfettered market, Keynesianism even called for some state ownership of crucial national enterprises like railways or energy companies. Box 2. Keynesian Macroeconomics. John Maynard Keynes's literary masterpiece, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, was published in 1936 at the height of the Great Depression. The book gained instant prominence because it successfully challenged classical liberal ideas about how modern economies worked. Keynesian ideas proved to be crucial in the development of the theoretical framework of macroeconomics. This new field proclaimed that it was possible for national governments to aggregate data and predict economic crises in advance of their occurrence, thus proposing the use of various policies to intervene in and make adjustments to the economy. Specifically, governments were to increase public spending during economic recessions in order to spur growth and reduce spending during periods of boom in order to keep inflation in check. Keynesian ideas dominated macroeconomics until the rise of neoliberal doctrines in the early 1970s. Keynes led the British delegation at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference in the United States, which established the post-war international economic order and its international economic institutions. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, was created to administer the international monetary system. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, was initially designed to provide loans for Europe's post-war reconstruction. During the 1950s, however, its purpose was expanded to fund various industrial projects in developing countries around the world. Finally, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was established in 1947 as a global trade organization charged with fashioning and enforcing multilateral trade agreements. In 1995, the World Trade Organization, WTO, was founded as the successor organization to GATT and subsequently became the focal point of intense public controversy over its neoliberal design of free trade agreements. The political applications of Keynesian ideas inspired what some economists call the Golden Age of controlled capitalism, which lasted roughly from 1945 to 1975. The American New Deal and Great Society programs spearheaded by FDR and President Lyndon Johnson were modeled on the much-admired model of Swedish social democracy and the British version of social welfarism launched in 1945 by Prime Minister Clement Attlee. The global appeal of Keynesianism culminated in a broad political consensus among Western nations that led some pundits to proclaim the end of ideology. Under the Keynesian economic regime, national governments exercised significant control over money flows in and out of their territories. In addition, progressive taxes on wealthy individuals and profitable corporations led to the expansion of the welfare state. Moreover, rising wages and increased social services in the wealthy countries of the global north offered workers entry into the middle class. Box 3. The Golden Age of Controlled Capitalism in the United States. The capitalist economy was based on mass production. Mass production was profitable because a large middle class had enough money to purchase what could be produced in large volume. The middle class had the money because the profits from mass production were divided up between big business and their suppliers, retailers, and employees. The bargaining power of labor was enhanced and enforced by favorable government action. Almost a third of the American workforce belonged to a union and benefited from steady wage rises delivered by means of legally guaranteed collective bargaining processes. Economic benefits were spread across the nation, to farmers, veterans, smaller towns, and small business, through regulatory mechanisms applying to railroads, telephones, utilities, and small businesses, as well as generous subsidies in the form of price supports, highways, and federal loans. Even U.S. President Richard Nixon, a conservative Republican, proclaimed as late as 1970 that "we are all Keynesians now." It was the Keynesian advocacy of an interventionist state and regulated markets that gave liberalism its modern economic meaning. A doctrine favoring a large active government, regulation of industry, high taxes for the rich, and extensive social welfare programs for all. In the 3 decades following the Second World War, modern egalitarian liberalism delivered spectacular economic growth rates, high wages, low inflation, and unprecedented levels of material well-being and social security. But this golden age of controlled capitalism ground to a halt with the severe economic crises of the 1970s. In response to such unprecedented calamities as oil shocks that quadrupled the price of petrol overnight, the simultaneous occurrence of runaway inflation and rising unemployment, stagflation, and falling corporate profits, an entirely new breed of liberals sought a way forward by recasting some of the core elements of classic liberalism under the novel conditions of globalization. These neoliberals subscribe to a common set of ideological and political principles dedicated to the worldwide spread of an economic model emphasizing free markets and free trade. And yet they emphasized different parts of their theory according to their particular social contexts. Worshipped by their followers and detested by the Keynesians, neoliberals succeeded in the early 1980s in setting the world's economic and political agenda for the next quarter century. As we shall discuss in Chapter 2, they argued that crippling government regulation, exorbitant public spending, and high tariff barriers to international trade had been responsible for creating conditions that led to high inflation and poor economic growth throughout the industrial countries in the 1970s. Once this premise became widely accepted, it was the logical next step to claim that these factors remained the major impediment to successful economic development in the global South. Thus was born a global neoliberal development agenda based primarily on so-called structural adjustment programs, SAPs, and international free trade agreements. As we shall see in Chapters 3 and 4, powerful economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank imposed their neoliberal agenda on heavily indebted developing countries in return for much-needed loans. The 1991 demise of the Soviet Union and the acceleration of market-oriented reforms in communist China led to the unprecedented dominance of the neoliberal model in the 1990s. As we noted in the preface, however, during the last decade, neoliberalism has come under a series of criticisms. The 2008-2009 GFC triggered a series of challenges to the still dominant free market paradigm that boosted the political fortunes of national populism around the world, a development most spectacularly reflected in 2016's pro-Brexit referendum in the UK and the Trump election victory in the same year. But before we can appreciate the full magnitude of the threats facing neoliberalism, we must familiarize ourselves with its various dimensions, varieties, and policy applications. Let us commence our journey with a brief consideration of its core ideas and principles. The four dimensions of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a rather broad and general concept referring to an economic model or paradigm that rose to prominence in the 1980s. Built upon the classical liberal ideal of the self-regulating market, neoliberalism comes in several strands and variations. Perhaps the best way to conceptualize neoliberalism is to think of it as four intertwined manifestations. 1. An ideology. 2. A mode of governance. 3. A policy package. 4. A particular form of capitalism. Let us carefully unpack these fundamental domains. Ideologies are systems of widely shared ideas and patterned beliefs that are accepted as truth by significant groups in society. Such isms serve as indispensable conceptual maps or mental models, because they guide people through the complexity of their political worlds. They not only offer a more or less coherent picture of the world as it is, but also as it ought to be. In doing so, ideologies organize their core ideas into fairly simple truth claims that encourage people to act in certain ways. These claims are assembled by codifiers of ideologies to legitimize certain political interests and to defend or challenge dominant power structures. The codifiers of neoliberalism are global power elites that include managers and executives of large transnational corporations, corporate lobbyists, influential journalists, and public relations specialists, intellectuals writing for a large public audience, celebrities and top entertainers, state bureaucrats, and politicians. Serving as the chief advocates of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?